money, sex, and kids. Now, we all know these are three of the most common sources of disagreement in marriage. Now, in your clinical training, you probably had a class on human sexuality, and depending on your program, you probably got some training in parenting. But what about money? What about personal finance? What about family finance? Now, in a recent diary study, about 20% of the arguments that couples reported involved money. And conflict about money predicts marital distress and divorce. But sadly, these aren't covered in many clinical training programs. But it is one of the big three sources of stress in marriage, so it's probably worth learning a little bit about. Now, we're also in the midst of an extended economic recovery, and the emphasis on the extended part of that. The only thing that's certain is that it's going to take a long time for our country to recover from where we're at. Now, for some people, this period of unemployment is going to affect them their entire lives in the same way that the Great Depression affected prior generations. Now, there's a lot of people now who worry about things that they used to take for granted, like getting a job or paying for medical bills or putting food on the table. Now, these choices affect not only their pocketbooks, but also their mental health. And there has never been a better time to look at the relationship between money and happiness. Now, this class is about the relationship between money and happiness, but more than that, it's how to be happier without necessarily earning more. How to be happier while spending less and consuming less, or how to live richly without being rich. My hope is that this class will be useful to you as a therapist to help your clients as they wrestle with the psychological aspect of the financial decisions that they make and how to help them make better financial decisions and also increase their well-being. And this class is adapted from an upcoming book chapter on the topic of thrift and happiness, but this version is specifically applied to clinical settings. How much do we really need? Well, it's a really old question. And Tolstoy wrote a short story about it in 1886. Now, the title of his story was his version of the question, and that was, how much land does a man require? And in this story, a peasant aspires to transcend his social class and become a wealthy landowner. And now he eventually buys some land, but quickly discovers that it's not big enough. It doesn't satisfy him. So while he's out in the countryside looking to buy more land, he runs across the deal of a lifetime. So you could call it like an all-you-can-eat real estate buffet. For a modest amount of money, this landowner is going to sell him as much land as he can walk around. But the catch is he has to leave when the sun rises and he has to be back before the sun sets. So of course, takes him up on this offer and he stakes out this enormous claim. He goes really far, but he actually wanders a little too far and he almost doesn't make it back before the sun sets. In fact, he has to run most of the way. And although he's staked out this enormous claim, the physical exertion is just too much for him. And he collapses and he dies. And his servant digs a hole and buries him in an ordinary grave. So how much land does a man require? Well, Tolstoy does the math, and his answer is 6 feet. From your head to your toes, that's all you really need. Now, of course, this is an old story, but as we're in the midst of, a record number of foreclosures, underwater mortgages, we could probably ask this question. How many homes does an American require? Now, if Tolstoy were writing today, he might write a story about a middle-class man who falls asleep at the wheel of his financed luxury car while going from job to job and plows into a tree because he's trying to work 4 jobs to pay 2 mortgages. So what really matters and what doesn't matter? What do we really need and what's extra? Now, fortunately, we have more than intuition and tradition to shed light on these questions. We now have decades of psychological research on the topic of money and happiness. And this is research that both confirms and challenges some conventional wisdom. Now, I should point out, it's really important to know that maybe perhaps some widely held beliefs are in fact false. So, for example, there's a bumper sticker that says, "He who dies with the most toys wins." And this is expressing a patently materialistic worldview. Now, if this were your worldview, you would want to know about all the disadvantages of materialism. And you might want to change your mind about your priorities if you want to have a happy life. But when research supports an idea that you have, it's just as important to know that too. For example, highly valuing relationships. It's not just a random value that's instilled maybe by your parents or by your culture that just maybe it works for some people but not for others. Relationships are a fundamental human need. We need people. And it's good to know that research supports that idea. It's not just a random idea, it's actually a human need. As therapists, as you help your clients move from floundering to flourishing, there has never been a better time to dive into this area. Now, of course, researchers don't know everything there is to know about happiness, but we have more scientific studies than we've ever had on this topic. It's a great time, and there's a lot to know. This class has 5 main parts. First, we're going to look at the relationship between money and happiness, so how much happiness you can actually buy with money. And we're going to survey dozens of studies conducted in over 100 countries over the past 30 years. Second, we're going to look at why more money often fails to produce more happiness. Scientists have identified at least 3 reasons why more money doesn't mean more happiness, and sometimes it means less. Third, I'll introduce you to the concept of thrift and define a few terms, and we'll take a brief look at thrift through history and some thrifty communities. And fourth, I'll show you some of the optimal conditions for practicing thrift, so under what circumstances can living on less work out amazingly well. And last, I'll give you 10 principles on applying thrift to boost happiness. So these are things you can do with your clients that can help them flourish financially and psychologically. And we'll spend a lot of the class time here. So let's get started. First, we need to talk about some measurement issues. So this is a little background on the research that we're citing. Now, there's a long tradition in economics and other scientific fields of measuring people's objective circumstances. So these are things like income and wealth and health. Now, for a long time, scientists use these measures as a proxy for a person's quality of life. So the problem, however, like in the case of physical health, is that although health is very, very important, it is not the same as mental health. In fact, objective health and happiness aren't highly correlated. You may know healthy people who are unhappy. You may also know people who are struggling with illnesses who are nonetheless optimistic about their life and content. So actually, it's the perception of one's health that is related to happiness, but objectively, there isn't a strong relationship. Now, another often used measure that maybe governments use is gross domestic product, it's an economic measure of all the goods and services produced by a country. Now, GDP is used to assess how well the country is doing as a whole, and the assumption tends to be if this number is rising, then people are doing better. And there's other measures such as unemployment and such as income that try and get at what the person's quality of life is. But again, these measures can only tell you so much about how well people are doing. So the truth is you can be rich and miserable, you can live on a fixed income and yet be happy. So there was a need for new kinds of measures to assess people's own perception of their quality of life. Now, a key contribution of positive psychology is the acceptance and refinement of subjective measures. So psychologists just ask people how they're feeling, if they're happy, how satisfied they are with the way their life is going. And it seems pretty obvious that we should have been doing it that way in retrospect, but there were good reasons why scientists were kind of suspicious of people's answers. Sometimes people tell you what they think you want to hear. Sometimes their answers change. So it took decades to establish that simply asking people was a method with good validity and reliability. Now, here are 4 common types of measures that are used in research on happiness. The first is called life satisfaction. So people answer questions like, so far, have you gotten the things you wanted out of life? Or how much do you agree with the statement, the conditions of my life are excellent? So life satisfaction is a cognitive appraisal of happiness. But of course, therapists are going to say, well, what about feelings? Well, so there's other measures of flourishing that would be like the frequency of positive and negative emotions. Positive feelings would be things like awe, peace, joy, gratitude, interest, love, and confidence. And negative feelings would be things like anger, annoyance, disgust, embarrassment, guilt, and sadness. So we'd ask people, how often have you felt loved over the past week? Like all the time, never, some of the time, like that kind of thing. And these questions help get at your emotional experience. Researchers measure positive and negative feelings separately for reasons that should be very obvious to therapists. You can have mixed feelings. So the classic example is, how would you feel watching your mother-in-law drive off a cliff in your new Mercedes? So at any given time, you can feel positively, you can feel negatively, you can feel nothing, or you can have, mixed feelings. Now, the scientific term for happiness is subjective well-being, and it's a composite measure based on the 3 previous measures. So there's 1 cognitive measure and 2 affective measures. So from a research perspective, happiness or subjective well-being is high life satisfaction, frequent positive emotions, and infrequent negative emotions. So from now on, when I talk about happiness, I'm just going to mean subjective well-being. And for the most part, when we talk about the objective measures, we're going to be talking mostly about income. So how much money can you buy with happiness? Overall, there are 6 major research findings on the relationship between money and happiness. And the first one is that there is definitely a relationship between money and happiness, but you might be surprised at how strong the relationship is. Money buys happiness. Now, it is a fact, but it's not as strong as you think, and it doesn't buy as much as you think. In fact, not only is the exchange rate surprising, it's actually pretty crummy. Now, there are a lot of benefits to being rich. Rich people have, better physical health. They have fewer stressful life events. They experience fewer violent crimes. They get lighter prison sentences. Their babies are less likely to die. Their kids are less likely to drop out of school. So with all these benefits, it's a little surprising to most people that rich people aren't really happy. They're just a little more happy. So one statistic is that poor people are about 20% less likely to report adequate life satisfaction than the rich. So there's definitely a relationship, but it's not super strong. And especially given all the benefits we mentioned, it's surprisingly small. So why is this the case? Well, the second major research finding is that, as it turns out, the more you earn, the less it matters. The relationship between money and happiness is most strong when you're poor, but it wanes as income rises. So in other words, the money that keeps you out of poverty makes you the happiest. And at a certain point, more income matters very little. And some researchers have even calculated what this magic amount is. And what they came up with was a modest income of about $75,000 in the US. Now, past that, it made very little difference. The other way to think about it is that as you get richer, it's the relative amounts that matter more than the absolute amount. So $100 means more to a poor person, but it really means very little to a rich person. And there's an often quoted line by Senator Everett Dirksen. He was known to be really thrifty and felt like Congress always lost sight of how much money that they were actually spending. So his quote was, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And when your budgets have so much money, you really get disconnected from what the actual amount is that you're talking about, and it just doesn't affect you the way it would if you were at the low end of that ladder. So the more you earn, the less it matters. Now, the third finding is that money only buys certain kinds of happiness. Now, remember when we talked about the different subjective measures, and that subjective well-being has 3 parts: life satisfaction, positive emotions, and negative emotions. So what kind of happiness is most for sale? Is it more satisfaction, lots of good feelings, or fewer bad feelings? Well, as it turns out, money most relates to life satisfaction. So if you just ask people how satisfied they are with their lives, their answers are highly influenced by how much money they make. But do rich people feel happier than everybody else, like every minute of the day? Well, not so much. See, here's a good study. The owners of luxury sedans have been found to be no happier during the car trip, like when they're using the car, than owners of compact 2-door coupes, unless their car's attributes were on their minds while they're driving. So in order to have a happy thought make you feel happy, you have to be thinking it. And if it's not on your mind, then it's not making a difference. So the aspect of flourishing that's least related to money is positive feelings. And your moment-to-moment positive feelings are more related to getting your psychological needs met. And they flow from your daily activities, but also your context, such as where you are and who you're with. And money doesn't give you as big of an advantage here. In fact, if your money attracts greedy, self-absorbed people, this could actually be a handicap. In other words, if we just took people off the street randomly, we could infer more about their present feelings from what they were doing and who they were with than from going through their wallets. So altogether, money can't buy every kind of happiness. It most relates to high life satisfaction, and at least relates to positive emotions. Now, fourth, this is the way we say it, that a rising tide lifts all boats, but the tanker still towers over the tug. And what we mean by that is there's this paradox about the impact of economic prosperity. And when the economy is doing well, everybody wins. And if you look at the short term, you might think that rising incomes make this big difference. But these effects tend to be very short-lived. If you look over years of time, like over 10 years, the effects of rising incomes disappear. So just because a country is getting richer doesn't mean all the citizens are going to be happier. Let's take a look at a graph to see what we're talking about here. On this graph, we have a number of countries listed. On the bottom axis is the growth in GDP. Now, the further left you go, the less growth in GDP, and the further right you go, the more growth in GDP. On the vertical axis is change in life satisfaction. So higher placement means there's an increase in life satisfaction, and lower placement means there's a decrease in life satisfaction. Now notice China, which is the fastest developing country in history. Notice how life satisfaction has slightly decreased over this time. Now Korea has also grown their GDP at an amazing pace, and you think people would be dancing in the streets, and they've gotten happier, but not by an extreme amount. And notice the rest of the world, kind of clustered at moderate growth, some increasing life satisfaction, and some decreasing. Now when you compute the overall trend, it actually looks like growth is bad for life satisfaction, like the line would be negative. So why do economic conditions make only short-term changes in happiness? Well, as we're kind of alluding to with the tide analogy, people's relative standings stay the same. So if the poor are getting richer, the rich are getting obscenely wealthy, and relative comparisons matter, perhaps more than they should. So in the end, if everyone takes a step ahead, we're all in the same relative position. And also people tend to increase their expectations, and this undermines the impact of getting more. And we're going to talk about each of these tendencies a little later. But the moral of the story is favorable economic conditions affect happiness only over the short term. Now, fifth, researchers are fond of saying correlation doesn't mean causation. So just because we find a relationship between A and B doesn't mean A causes B. It could mean that B causes A, or that both A and B are caused by C. So people always assume that you get more money and then you become happier. And part of this is true, but also research documents that happier people go on to earn a higher income. So if you ask someone how happy they are, it can help you predict their unemployment and increases in income several years down the road. There's a great review article about all the benefits of frequent positive feelings. That's by Sonia Lubomirsky and Laura King and Ed Diener. But we highlight this fact to show you that the relationship between money and happiness is certainly bidirectional. Don't make the mistake of thinking that money always preceded happiness. Happiness also attracts wealth. Now, the sixth finding is a life spent chasing possessions rarely catches happiness. So when I first saw The Social Network, the movie about the founders of Facebook, it really made me want to stop using Facebook. It was all the backstabbing and all the dishonesty, and just I was amazed at how much materialism there was, like in the foundations of the company. Now, I don't know how well that movie matched reality, but here's what we do know. So materialism is defined as the strong, internalized pursuit of fame and fortune, or too much emphasis on attractiveness and acquisition. Now, the clear picture that emerges from research is how bad materialism is for people. Materialistic people tend to have lower life satisfaction, more unhappiness, more depression and anxiety, as well as a host of other problems, including headaches, personality disorders, narcissism, and antisocial behavior. Materialists have much poorer relationships. So that's the making a few enemies part of Facebook. And that means if you ask materialists to rate their own relationships, they'll rate the quality lower. And if you ask their families and friends, they'll say the same thing. So there's widespread agreement on this point. Materialists have poor relationships no matter who you ask. And a lot of this work comes from Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois. So money may be important and it may be necessary, but too much emphasis on money is detrimental for well-being. So if you take it all together, there's this well-known saying that money is like breathing, and you must breathe to exist, but you don't exist to breathe. So you could say money is essential for living, but insufficient for thriving, and that is a good summary of this entire area. Now, what does that mean in a clinical setting? What does that mean for clients? Well, at the low end, don't underestimate the benefits of financial counseling, of getting like practical help managing money. Now, a lot of times therapists end up being kind of the central hub for clients' care and making the referrals to outside resources. So if people need medication, then they make the referral to a psychiatrist. So for people at the low end of the socioeconomic spectrum, helping them get financial counseling could have a lot of psychological benefits for them. So maybe that might mean getting a referral list for people with financial related problems, maybe that might mean starting a support group for those with financial difficulties, or a support group for people who are unemployed, or maybe some referrals for some places where they could get career counseling. It's really a practical thing, but it is so important, especially at the low end, can be really beneficial for their mental health. Now, as people get wealthier, money matters less and less. So that's really a great opportunity. So there's so much work you can do with a client to help improve their life that has nothing to do with their circumstances. That has nothing to do with their income, but maybe some choices they can make. And the rest of this session, we're going to talk about how to help clients find more happiness without a lot of money. And if you see clients who have a real materialistic worldview, it can be helpful to know not only that it's bad for them, but why it's bad for them. So Kasser has a good book called The High Price of Materialism, came out in 2003. That's a good book that'll also explain what goes wrong, so you know kind of what questions to ask for clients that may be struggling with that, and you know kind of where to go with them and how to help them. Now, why doesn't money make people as happy as it could? Now we're going to look at least 3 reasons why this is true. And some of these will be true for your clients, and by understanding what breaks down, we can gain insight in how to overcome it. Now there's a Yiddish proverb that says, the heart is half a prophet. But unfortunately, people are about as accurate in predicting how they're going to feel as they are predicting the weather. People make a number of errors when they start forecasting how they're going to feel in the future. So for example, people suppose that winning the lottery will make them happy for the rest of their lives. But what they fail to see is that, the euphoria from any positive event is temporary, and a spectacular positive event can actually make the rest of life seem pretty dull. And there's a lot of problems associated with being wealthy that other people wouldn't anticipate, such as people asking you for money all the time, worries about spoiling your children, or maybe being constantly suspicious of other people's motives. So these are called affective forecasting errors. So affect means feelings, forecasting means the future. And 2 of the researchers that do a lot of work on this are Tim Wilson and Dan Gilbert. Now, in general, people tend to overestimate the happiness that they're going to get out of any single positive event. So like winning the lottery, or getting married, for example, like there's a boost that you get, but it only lasts about 2 years. People also tend to overestimate how long they're going to feel bad after something negative happens. So that might be breaking up with someone or getting passed over for a promotion. People think it's going to be a lot worse than it actually is. And they underestimate the ability of their psychological immune system to get over it. People are pretty resilient, actually, and they can make meaning and they can cope with it fairly well, and a lot of times a lot better than they think they can. Now, people also think having a lot of options is a good thing, but in reality, too many options is worse for decision making and for subsequent satisfaction. The best example of this is a modern wedding in the US, which is death by 1,000 choices. You have to figure out all of these things, from what are your vows going to be to what color napkins you're going to have. And even simple things like, well, we're just going to have blue napkins is actually really complicated because there's a million kinds of blue. There's royal blue, navy blue, ocean blue, aqua, turquoise, cobalt, ultramarine. You have to make all of these choices, and it's actually quite overwhelming because then you second guess yourself, and actually the entire process would just be easier if you just had fewer choices. Now, similarly, offering a return policy is often bad for people's satisfaction. Now, if you know that you couldn't return it, you would just cope with it. But knowing that you can return it, you keep going back and forth and wondering if you made a good decision. So researchers in this area, like I mentioned before, are Tim Wilson, Dan Gilbert, and also with choices, Barry Schwartz does a lot of work on decision fatigue, of why more choice isn't necessarily a good thing. So why do people make these mistakes? Well, when they look into the future, they tend to think of life events very abstractly, but in reality, it's the details that matter the most. So for example, when you're in college, maybe you think graduation is going to be awesome, and getting a job and a paycheck, like all that's going to be really great. However, if you get a job, and in most situations, or most times in history you do, now is kind of an exception, a job is a mix of good and bad things. You may hate your boss, it might be highly stressful, it might be unfulfilling. So people tend to look at the future very abstractly, and that's why they're not good at actually forecasting how they're going to feel in that situation. And there are far too many kinds of forecasting errors to mention, but the key idea is that oftentimes people are bad at predicting what's going to make them happy. So they pursue the wrong things, and maybe they spend money badly, and that money that they spend is not actually going to make them happy, or could actually backfire and make them more unhappy. So as for therapists, it's actually good to know what these affective forecasting errors are, and probably some of them you figured out kind of intuitively, but knowing those can help you kind of guide your clients better when they're telling you maybe what their plans are. You can help ask questions, you can maybe help them make more accurate emotional forecast, and hopefully that will translate to better decisions. But that's the first major reason why more money doesn't mean more happiness, because people choose poorly based on bad forecast. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's no blessing, there's no thing that can happen that's going to bring perpetual bliss. So there's always a point where, like as B.B. King might say, the thrill is gone. We adapt. And scientists call this process hedonic adaptation. So hedonic means feelings, and adaptation means that you get used to it. Now, hedonic adaptation seems bad, but it's actually a good thing, and it's a good reason why we have it. So, as for example, according to my dad, after I was toilet trained, for a long time, I was really proud of myself. And I've actually heard this is pretty common for kids. So we go to a restaurant, and I'd come back from the restroom, and I'd say at the top of my lungs, I TT'd. I was really happy about it, and I just thought everybody would want to know. Now, if it weren't for hedonic adaptation, I'd probably still be doing that some 30 years later. I would call up my dad, and I'd tell him that I TT'd by myself without any problems, just so he could know, and that would make me really happy. So hedonic adaptation is really useful. It's good to adapt to what doesn't change. That gives us an encouragement to seek out new things, to master new challenges. But in the sense of, if you wanted to improve your life and actually make your life happier, then hedonic adaptation is problematic. It means that we're going to keep returning to our set point, a large degree to which is genetically determined. Now, there's two processes that underlie hedonic adaptation. Now, first is that whatever it is that happens, that positive change, over time it just produces fewer and fewer positive feelings. So the metaphor might be that the creek dries up. So once we maybe remodel our bathroom, the marble tile now has this really nice shine. It really catches our eye. And every time we walk into the bathroom, we feel great. But over time, we're going to notice it less and less. And eventually, it's going to fade completely into the background of life. And that's the point that we've adapted, when it just doesn't give us any special feelings anymore. Now, the second process that underlies hedonic adaptation is that our standards tend to rise after a positive change. So using the bathroom analogy, after we remodel the bathroom, we'll start to notice that our bedroom now looks a little drab by comparison. Now before, the bedroom was neutral because we were used to it, and the bathroom was a positive. But now that our expectations have risen, the bathroom is a neutral and the bedroom is a negative. So that's a common problem, is that unfettered expectations, like they keep rising and they keep rising. So as a more maybe extreme example, you have Alexander the Great, who as a really young man, he had some incredible military victories. He had this enormously successful Persian campaign, but he wasn't satisfied. And the next thing he wanted to do was to conquer the entire world, which he thought was just beyond kind of what is present-day Pakistan. So his army marched to India, but his men mutinied, and he had to come home. And then he was probably poisoned, and he died. Now there's an epitaph that summarizes his life this way: "A tomb now suffices him for whom the whole world was not sufficient." Now that's a real life person whose life was somewhat like our Russian peasant. Never enough, always wanting more and more. So only by understanding this rising expectation problem do we understand why people are unhappy even when life is going their way. They keep wanting more, they adapt, and eventually they're disappointed. Now we'll talk more about how to combat hedonic adaptation to increase happiness, but hedonic adaptation itself, that we adapt promptly, is the second reason why too much is not enough. Now, given the first two problems, that people forecast poorly and they adapt promptly, it's easy to see what happens next. Either way, people feel neutral or they feel bad again. So what happens? Well, people spend more. They keep spending. Now, a fifth of the people worth more than $1 million to $10 million spent all their income or more than their income. It's amazing that even people that have the means to save money overspend it. And it's so hard for us to believe maybe how celebrities and lottery winners can end up penniless after just a few years. But even normal people like us, we often live well above our standard of living. We maybe spend our paycheck before we get it. We borrow more than we can pay back. When we get behind and we never catch up. Now, the analogy that scientists use is the hedonic treadmill. So it's that cycle of gaining and adapting. And we never get ahead for very long. We keep coming back to the same spot over and over. So some people, they keep purchasing and possessing, but they never reach the point of satisfaction. And although they have more and more, they get less and less happy from it. And also they risk a lot of problems because of the overspending. So these are the three reasons why money doesn't give us as much happiness as it could. We predict poorly, we adapt promptly, we often spend profligately. And that means that the extra money often goes to waste. So here's the opportunity. If the money's often wasted, well, maybe we can spend less and we're not going to really lose that much. Maybe we can spend a little smarter and actually get more benefit from it. So that's the opportunity that thrift offers. It's smarter spending that makes us happier. Now, none of these ideas are new ideas, but given how much our culture embraces materialism and consumerism, these ideas are increasingly less and less modeled and less advocated. Now, in America, on average, you'll see about 3,000 to 5,000 ads per day. So that's 3,000 to 5,000 product pitches, 3,000 to 5,000 messages on how to part with your cash. But how often are you encouraged to be more frugal or thrifty? Probably not very often, and at least nowhere near as often as you're encouraged to spend. So let's talk a little bit about thrift. What do we mean by thrift? Well, the first thing to point out is that thrifty doesn't mean stingy. Sometimes that's a perception that people have of the word thrift. But the word thrift actually originates from the term thrive. Now, a good working definition is a voluntary lifestyle choice involving the careful stewardship of finite resources, such as time, money, and possessions, for optimal long-term results. Now, the key point is that it's a choice. It's a decision. It's not something that's forced on you. It's an individual choice that you make. And it involves managing and skill. So it's easy to spend a budget, but it's a lot harder to make it last. And it focuses on managing time, money, and possessions, whereas, materialism is just the focus on acquisition of things. Now, thrift is relevant in both times of feast and times of famine. Now, in times of scarcity, you may need it to survive. But even in times of abundance, thrift aids in psychological survival because of all the dangers of materialism. So thrift helps people focus on what really matters, and it kind of keeps us from overdoing it. So thrift is restraint at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Now, thriftiness has close associations with the virtue of industry, so that's hard work. And that means, the harder you work for something, like the less likely you're going to be to waste it. And also, thrift is about spending our effort on what matters rather than pursuing things that are frivolous. Now, thrift often goes by the term frugality in consumer research, and they define frugality as the consumer restraint in the acquisition of goods and resourcefulness in using them to achieve long-term goals. So those definitions are kind of interchangeable. Now, there's a similar but completely different term that's called a tightwad, and this has actually been studied in research. They have research studies on tightwads, and tightwads and thrifty people spend less. But tightwads don't want to spend money on anything, even necessities. And they have different motivations that we'll talk about in a minute. I will use the terms thrift and frugality interchangeably throughout the rest of the presentation. Now, thrift spans history and culture. In just a few examples, like in Buddhism, for example, there's texts that talk about how thrifty monks would get the most out of their possessions. When their robes got too old, they would make them into quilts. And when the quilt was too old, then it became like a cover. When the cover got too old, it became a rug. The old rugs became a duster. And eventually the dusters were mixed with clay and were used to fill holes in the wall. So that's a very impressive life cycle of continuing to use cloth. In another example, on the management of money and resources, Confucius taught extravagance leads to arrogance, but prudence to steadfastness, and instead of arrogance, prefer steadfastness. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have King Solomon noticing that those who loved money were never satisfied with their incomes, and that rich people could never sleep peacefully because they worried about their wealth. And in philosophy, you have Socrates encouraging people not to pursue fame, fortune, or wealth, but instead to focus on finding truth, wisdom, and self-improvement. So thrift can be found in many cultures and religious traditions. Now, America has a special relationship to thrift that arises for historical reasons. So when the colonists made the long voyage across the ocean, they didn't have many possessions with them, and they needed to grow their own food and make their own clothes and build their own tools. And everything they had to make it last because they couldn't just run to the shop and buy something new. So it was a really hard life, and thrift meant survival. So there's also Puritan and Quaker communities that encouraged hard work and productivity and strongly discouraged wasteful consumption. You also have the Amish that tended to shun technology or anything that they thought was just unnecessary and kind of frivolous, and especially anything that interfered with the community. Now, probably the biggest proponent of thrift was Benjamin Franklin, and he was a founding father and a scientist and a newspaper publisher. He published Poor Richard's Almanac, which had a lot of folksy wisdom on virtues and finance and other practical matters. Now, on the importance of thrift, Franklin advised, if you would be wealthy, think of saving as much as getting. The Indies have not made Spain rich because her outgoes are greater than her income. Now, although Franklin himself became wealthy from his publishing business, he embodied many of the virtues espoused by his publication, such as industry and generosity and thrift. He provided the seed money for his employees to launch their own newspapers, and he also refused to personally profit from his numerous scientific inventions, and he devoted a lot of time to building libraries, paving roads, and other public service. There are a lot of Franklin quotes relevant to thrift, and Franklin himself is a really interesting person to study. But, throughout history, thrift goes in and out of fashion. So in times such as World War II, Americans pulled together, they practiced conservation on a massive scale, and American thrift, you could say, helped win the war. We've got some signs that show some of the government posters advocating thrift. And Americans, until recently, were pretty good at this. But during periods of prosperity, thrift goes out the window, and it's only the preachers and the philosophers that really talk about it. Now, our current economy is about 2/3 based on consumer spending. So that's why you get this message from the top, policy leaders, government leaders, that tell people to keep spending because there's this great fear of what will happen to the economy if the American consumer starts cutting back. But from a happiness perspective, our rapid economic growth over the past several decades and increased consumerism really hasn't translated to increased happiness, and if anything, we have increasing levels of depression and anxiety. So all that is to say that thrift has been more unpopular than not in the modern era, although during this recent recession, there's been an increase in people learning how to cut back simply out of necessity. But that's not to say that everyone everywhere is materialistic. There are growing communities where thriftiness is more the norm, or thriftiness is a core value, or even that it's become fashionable. And this is really good for you to know, because if your clients want to make a big life change, it's always easier if there's a community to support it. So some of the communities I want to mention that are really available to anyone are the ones that are thriving now because of the internet. So for example, you have Craigslist. Now, there's some of Craigslist that are scammers and thieves and that kind of thing, but the majority of people they're local, they're honest, and they're thrifty. And the whole idea behind Craigslist is to reuse. It's kind of like an internet version of a garage sale. So you don't have to buy it new. You can generally find it inexpensively on Craigslist. Now, even before Craigslist, there was a website called eBay. That's also kind of a thrifty community. So again, selling used things rather than buying new things. Now there's this concept called extreme couponing that's become popular recently. So there's some websites such as the Crazy Coupon Lady and the Grocery Store Game. And these are, communities of people who are coming together to help each other save a lot of money on food and show you how to get the coupons and what coupons are available. So there's a lot of support you can get from people from those websites. Now there's some others that you might not have heard of because they're really recent. There's some things like Airbnb, which is a place where people can rent their apartments to each other instead of staying in a hotel when they travel. And then there's this increasingly strong do-it-yourself movement. One example would be Make. So it's more about people building their own technology and kind of enjoying the process of building rather than going out and just buying like the gadgets as they're marketed from Apple or other electronics retailers. So if you check out our supplementary documents, you'll see that I put together a list of some thrifty internet communities. So some of these have subscriptions, but a lot of them don't. And there's tools, books, and there's websites where people can go. So this is something I was hoping that if you have a client who needs help in this area, this would be just a real quick referral list that you could give to them for some resources that they could find. And even if they don't have internet access themselves, you can always find internet access at a public library. So that's becoming less and less of an issue. The main point is that thrift is an ancient practice. It really is a core American virtue, and it is alive and well in certain pockets. And we could all stand to hear a lot more about it to combat the materialism that we get exposed to every day. So even if we weren't blessed with a thrifty family or a thrifty community, you can still learn how to do it, and you can find a supportive community provided that the individual takes the initiative. Now, thrift isn't always associated with positive outcomes. So when you survey the research literature on thrift, you'll see some good outcomes, you'll see some bad outcomes, and sometimes there's no relationship with a particular outcome. Now, generally, when you have an inconsistent outcome, that means there are mediators or there are intervening factors that play a role in producing an outcome. So let's talk about the optimum conditions for the practice of thrift to be beneficial for well-being. So this is the optimum conditions, how to practice it so that it's actually good for people. So the first condition would be when thrift is freely chosen, when it's an autonomous choice. Now thrift, it's best as a lifestyle you choose rather than something that's imposed by other forces. So if we'd said before, maybe if you're poor and you have no choice, that's not necessarily going to be in and of itself like a good outcome because it's imposed on you. Although having good financial choices can help make bad circumstances less bad. Or the other way to this might not be good for you if you save because you feel guilty, not because you enjoy it. But if you have choices and you're choosing to live simply, then that's when you tend to see a really positive result from simplifying your life and from living on less. And that's when you'll find that it makes you happier. Now, the second condition would be when thrift builds competence. So anytime you're learning a new skill, you're developing confidence, you're developing competence, you're going to feel capable of taking care of things on your own. And you'll probably worry less because you know that you can do so many things. So for example, maybe building your own furniture, remodeling your own house, learning how to fix your own car, learning how to sew your own clothes, or maybe making pottery, learning how to bake your own bread, or do all kinds of cooking, figuring out how to use Craigslist in a safe way, or maybe how to bid on an auction. So one of the things you find is that it's very easy to spend money, and not really think about it, not really spend a lot of time on it. But it's a lot harder to be thrifty, to save, to research before you buy, to conserve. That takes a lot more effort. And so if you're learning some new skill that's going to help you save money, and that's building competence, then that's going to have a pretty good outcome. Now, number 3, as we alluded to before, when thrift is supported by the community, if it's supported by your close relationships, supported by your friends, by your community, that's going to have a good outcome. So for example, we have the Amish, that they practice very radical simplicity. Now also they have amazingly low rates of depression and anxiety compared with the rest of the US. And how does that work? Well, they have an extremely tightly knit supportive community. So they can do even extreme simplicity, but it works because the whole community is involved. Now, if you're the only one doing it, it's probably not going to have as good of an outcome because you're going to be kind of fighting against those around you. For example, Chuck Finney, he's one of the founders of duty-free shops, and in his biography, it talks about how, by the time most people figured out he was a billionaire, he'd already given away much of his wealth to his charitable foundation. He never really liked the lifestyle of a billionaire, and he wore a $25 watch for his entire life. But according to his biographer, his wife really did like the lifestyle, and that disagreement over, what kind of life are we going to live, how simple are we going to live, is part of what led to their eventual divorce. So Probably his thrift benefited him in other ways, but it did cause problems in his relationships. So the point is that thrift is even better and it's easier when it's supported by your relationships. Now, number 4, when your values and your circumstances are consistent. And for example, there's some studies that have suggested that part of the reason the debt is bad for people is that they worry about it. But if everybody just had a more carefree attitude about debt, then debt would be less bad for people. So this is one of those problems I think you get into when you're only looking at the outcome and you're not necessarily looking at how you get there. So yes, if you worry about something, it's going to, maybe decrease your well-being, and you shouldn't ruminate about something that you can't control. At the same time, my argument would be if you're taking on debt, if you're having to borrow, that you should be very cautious about what you're doing, and you should be concerned about that because it is a risk for you, financially, and how that affects your life. So it's going to be better if you're thrifty and you're able to be thrifty because of your situations. So there is going to be some kind of mismatch when your values and your circumstances are not consistent. So you have to borrow, but you don't enjoy borrowing. I would argue that's a good thing, but definitely you're going to see that effect. So when your values and your circumstances are consistent, it's going to have a better outcome. Now, number 5, when you can enjoy the consequences of your sacrifice, enjoy the consequences of your labor. Now, not everybody enjoys the fruit of their labor. So you might have people who grew up in the Great Depression, or they came through some kind of tragic set of circumstances. Maybe they immigrated to this country during an upheaval in their country, and they may be frugal for the rest of their lives because they're always worried about repeating that horrible, horrible experience. Now, we'll have people today, as I mentioned before, who are the long-term unemployed, who may never be the same after this economic crisis is over. Now, this kind of frugality is not good for people because it's driven by that hurt, it's driven by that fear, it's driven by anxiety, okay? That's not good for people because they're not able to enjoy the benefits of having sacrificed for so long because they're constantly worried about it changing and becoming bad again. So there's also extreme hoarders. So these are the people on the reality television shows. And just like any kind of addiction, this is something that kind of takes over your life and starts interfering with other aspects of your life. And that's more of a pathology that's not really good for people. You also have this category called a tightwad, and these are people who just hate to part with cash. And we know that tightwadism is associated with less happiness. They don't like to spend money on anything, even things that they need. So on the opposite extreme, people who spend too much, I would kind of argue they don't necessarily enjoy the fruits of their labor either because, extreme shopping is not really about the stuff. It's about the process, and it's about fulfilling that, that need to spend money kind of in a pathological way. And so a lot of times whatever is bought actually ends up in the corner, that it's the shopping itself that's the high. And being a spendthrift is also associated with less happiness. So really thrifty people can enjoy spending money. So they may save money so they can spend it on something that they really enjoy, like a trip or something that's really, really important to them. And they save all year to do that. But they get like the fun of the experience, but I would say with no unpleasant aftertaste from having made a poor financial decision. So they can actually enjoy life and enjoy the good decisions that they make. They can enjoy the fruits of their labor. And so you'll find when people are able to do that the outcome is good. And then finally, thrift is good when it's developing character, when it's developing maturity. So the ability to delay gratification has so many great outcomes in research literature. Also, people get thriftier as they get older, and probably reflecting on this ability to, more maturity, more intentionality in the decisions that are made. And I think that's also reflected in the finding that thrift is associated with greater intelligence. So you have people who have more information and are able to make better decisions about how they spend their money, and also with more independence. And that would be the good part of independence, and that is not being as influenced by other people's opinions and social comparisons. So one of the findings about happy people is that happy people are much less influenced by social comparison. So they can actually enjoy when someone's doing well. That doesn't really bring them down. And they're not constantly trying to compare themselves with other people. And that's a mark of maturity. And also, when thrifty people are less susceptible to what other people are doing. So they kind of set their own standards and how they want to live, independent on what other people are buying and what other lifestyles other people are living. And that also reflects maturity, and that's going to have a positive outcome. And finally, as people become more focused on meaningful pursuits and just less materialistic in general, that's also going to have the positive outcome. So all these related to when you're developing character, when you're developing maturity, as you're practicing thrift, that is definitely going to have a positive outcome for the individual who's practicing it. So now what we've done is we've kind of surveyed either research on thrift or research on happiness or both, taken some of the principles that we've talked about and applied it to get a little more practical of how do you get more happiness out of less money. Now, in general, these are things that could serve as the basis of homework assignments for your clients. It might be helpful to discuss with them in order to help them make better financial decisions. And it might help when you're developing like a comprehensive treatment plan or you're setting priorities for things to work on in therapy. So these are 10 general principles for getting more happiness out of less money. Now, the first principle is to cure ills before seeking thrills. Now, in one of Aesop's fables, there's a city mouse and a country mouse, and they're sampling each other's lifestyle. So they're kind of hosting a dinner and showing them what it's like to live where each one lives. But the country mouse really has a simple lifestyle, and he can only offer just some crumbs, not really that much. But the city mouse, he's got wine, cheese, fruit, all kinds of things that he's stolen from his homeowners. But during that dinner, it ends abruptly because the homeowners come back drunk and they have these huge dogs that basically chase the mice, out of the house. And finally, like the country mouse decides to go back to his house. And he says to his city friend, he says, "I'd rather have a crust in peace and safety than all your fine things in the midst of such alarm and terror." Now, this idea is echoed in a lot of different places. So, for example, in the book of Proverbs 17:1, you have better a dry morsel and quietness therewith than a house full of feasting and strife. So what are we saying here? Well, we're saying that bad things are worse than good things are good. Or you might say bad is stronger than good. Or another way to say it might be pain is more potent than pleasure. So it's better not to have the bad thing or the good thing than to have both bad and good, because bad is stronger than good. Now, this is a key insight into human experience. And actually, research backs up this idea. Now, we have bad and good here represented by comic book characters. So if you recognize Magneto and Cyclops, just to kind of give you a visual aid. Now, recall that well-being is three things. So that's high life satisfaction, frequent positive feelings, and infrequent negative feelings. Now, when you're trying to feel better, a lot of people just think about adding the positive thing. But another equally valid way is to reduce negative feelings. And a powerful reason to reduce negative feelings is that they're stronger than the positive ones. So again, if you think about maybe trying to lift a boat into the air, so we can add balloons or we can throw the rocks out. Now, if we want to get the boat in the air, we're going to need the balloons eventually, but we should probably start by throwing the rocks out because the rocks are heavier than the balloons are lighter. So you need positive affect and you need high life satisfaction, but removing negative emotions are a really good bang for the buck. So that's what we mean when we say curing the ills before seeking the thrills. So let's briefly talk through the research on this topic and what domains is bad stronger than good. So we have major life events such as trauma. So accident victims adapt more slowly to trauma than lottery winners do to winning the lottery. So in other studies, you have negative events tend to snowball, so they tend to add and get worse and worse, but positive events don't. Now, there are negative events, such as things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, that have extremely long-lasting negative consequences. And there's just no positive equivalent of that is as powerful for an individual. So, for example, a good sexual experience doesn't offset the trauma of a rape. A good massage doesn't offset the trauma of being beaten, to the edge of your life. So the negative events are so much more powerful. And even in minor life events, so like in diary studies, negative events tend to carry over to people's well-being the next day, but positive events tend not to. So we say like the bad days carry over, but the good days don't. Now, in the domain of sensory systems, bad smells are worse than good smells. Now, my wife is pregnant right now, and when you're pregnant, you're a lot more sensitive to smells. And what I hear her talk about the most are not the good smells, like this smells really good, or I really like this. It's the bad smells. It's the things that she smells that want to make her puke. Like that's what you hear about. So now in studies, bad smells elicit more of a facial reaction than good smells do. And this is also good for other sensory systems. So like in our example with massage, bad touch versus good touch, or maybe a disturbing, a really troubling picture versus a really beautiful one. And the same for taste, like a bad taste versus good taste. So bad is stronger than good in sensory systems. Now, if you think about close relationships, bad relational patterns are stronger than good ones. That is, the good ones can't offset the bad ones. You have John Gottman, who's observed hundreds of couples in his lab and analyzed their interaction patterns. And his findings were that in order to have a relationship that lasts, you don't just need slightly more good interactions than bad interactions. You need 5 times more good interactions than bad interactions, because the bad ones are 5 times as powerful. So other studies of constructive and destructive relationship patterns have found that, when they classified couples according to the patterns that they use, whether constructive or destructive, it was only the destructive ones that predicted the outcomes of relationship termination or relationship quality, not necessarily the positive ones. And in social networks, another example, you got children who, they tend to disagree on maybe who the most popular kid is, but everybody agrees on who's rejected. So bad being stronger than good. Now, in emotions, we actually have more words for bad emotions than we do for good emotions. And in one study, of all the emotional words that they identified, 62% were for negative emotions and 38% were for positive emotions. Now, it's also true if you ask someone to list how they're feeling, to list their emotions, they're going to tend to list more negative than positive. Now, in another domain, in emotional regulation, that is changing your emotion, people use more methods to escape a bad mood than to try to get into a good mood. So there's more things that they try because there's more incentive to get out of the bad mood. And they also use more energy to escape the bad mood. Now, we could go on and on. This is bad is stronger than good. It's true for recollection, when you tend to remember negative events more than positive events. It's true for physiological reactions involving your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. So in many domains, and in fact in practically every domain that the researchers survey that were writing this article, this is a Baumeister article on bad is stronger than good. Bad is stronger than good. There were no exceptions that they could find where good was stronger than bad. So the suggestion here is that by directing your spending toward the elimination of a problem, you get a 3 to 5-fold hedonic return on your investment. So practically, what does that mean? Well, the obvious example is that, going to counseling. We all know people who balk at paying a counselor to work on their personal issues or their relationship issues. And, the cost can be up to $150 an hour. And that is a lot of money. And so someone might say, well, I could go on a cruise. I could spend that much money on something else. I could spend that much money on something I enjoy. And that's true. The problem is you could go on a cruise, but when you have another humiliating fight with your spouse, that's going to drag you down a lot more than the cruise is going to give you a boost. So you get more happiness for the buck if you're eliminating an ill, if you're working on that thing that's causing you negative feelings. Now, a related item might be that clients should prioritize self-improvement and relationship improvement. So a lot of people, it's just not in perspective. They'll think nothing about, spending $500 on a phone, $400 on a purse, but they worry about the cost of going to Weight Watchers or the cost of joining a gym. So But the reality is, if people spend that much money on self-improvement and on relationship improvement, they'd feel so much better because they'd be working on those problems. So that might mean getting a personal trainer or aggressively treating their diabetes, really changing their lifestyle, maybe taking an assertiveness class, or again, going to marriage counseling, going to financial counseling, or addressing an addiction, something like alcohol, drugs, or prescription medication. So that's going to have a bigger payoff than whatever it is they buy as far as their overall well-being. Now, it's important as a therapist also to help your clients get a vision for their life and relationships. So the goal is not just slightly more good than bad. The goal is 5 times more good than bad, because bad is so much more potent. And that's something that, you can help your clients get that vision of where their life can be and what they should be aiming for. So in general, if you target the negative with your money instead of targeting the positive, it's going to pay off for you about 3 to 5 times more in terms of your happiness than if you're to go after the positive first. So cure ills before seeking thrills. Now, the second strategy is very much related to the first one, and that is to meet needs before indulging desires. And that's acquire the necessities of life before the luxuries, because the money spent on needs goes further than that spent on luxuries. Now, there's 3 main reasons why this works. So first, as George Bernard Shaw observed, our necessities are few, but our wants are endless. So there are a limited number of needs, and they're quite easy to meet, actually. So you have physiological needs like food, water, clothing, shelter, safety. Have some psychological needs like competence, autonomy, and fulfillment. You've got social needs like to be respected and connected with others. Now, just the items on this list explain 10 to 25% of the variation in happiness around the world. Now, that may sound like not a lot, but it actually is pretty substantial when you consider that maybe half of the variation in happiness is genetically determined. So just this list, up to 25% of the variation in happiness. Now, you'll notice this list is very similar to Maslow's list, except Maslow had more of a stepwise progression in needs. But the current view, especially based on this paper, a lot of research done around the world, is that the needs are simply additive. So you get all that you can whenever you can, and just because you're lacking one kind of need doesn't mean that you can't get the others. So meeting needs is relatively easy, and it's a lot shorter list than trying to meet desires. Now, second, utilities use the bad is stronger than good kind of principle to foster happiness. So that a utility prevents a really negative experience, while a luxury is about adding a positive experience. Now, the caveat here is that this is mostly true for physical needs. Psychological and social needs end up adding a lot of positive emotions as well, but really the physical needs are about preventing the negative experience. So for all the reasons that we've discussed before, meeting a physical need is a better value. So if you just think about, there's 2 kinds of shots, right? Like a Botox shot and a polio vaccine. Now, a shot of Botox is preventing fine lines and wrinkles, but a polio vaccine is preventing paralysis. And a polio shot is a much better deal because you don't really have a need to have perfectly smooth skin when you're 70 years old, right? That's not a need. That might be a little extra, but it's not a core need, whereas having polio is a really bad thing. So by preventing the polio, you're preventing this horrible negative experience. So as far as your happiness is concerned, it's a much better value. Now, third, utilities are always cheaper than luxuries. And the difference between, the lowest and the highest price version of the same kind of thing can be 10 to 1,000-fold. Now, there's a guy named Dave Ramsey. He's the host of a radio show on finances, and he encourages people when they're getting their life back on track financially to buy what he calls a cash car. And that's a car that runs, costs a few $1,000s, and save the money that you'd be spending on making the car payments and maybe put that toward a new car. Now, a $2,000 car can really meet your need for transportation. You don't need the $40,000 luxury car. The main benefit you get from the car, like not having to walk to work and not losing your job because you can't get to work, you get that for the $2,000 that you spend. The rest of the money that you spend is on leather, the new car smell, and the other things that you're going to adapt to pretty quickly. So you get a lot more happiness from the locks than the leather. That is, having the car and not having it stolen, like locking it up, is a lot more beneficial than having all the extras that you're going to forget about shortly. So meet needs first, and then think about desires. And a corollary to this might be buy utilities, rent pleasures. So if you think about an example of a boat, let's say you want a boat. Well, what's the purpose of the boat? Are you a fisherman? Do you work out on the Gulf of Mexico? In that case, your boat is more like a utility because it's something that you're going to use every day, and you should probably buy the boat. But if you're just a rich person and you work, in some other industry and you're just going to use the boat for enjoyment, rather than buying the boat because you're just using it for pleasure, it would make more sense to actually just rent it for the week that you're going to use it. Because the first part of any new thing is the best part, because that's the part when it's new to you, you haven't adapted yet. And so even though renting might be expensive, if you compare it to the full life of the boat, it's actually a pretty good deal if you think about just getting it for the first little part that's going to make the most difference to your happiness. So just get it for a week, rent it, and then give it back, and then you can use your money for something else rather than buying the entire boat. So the idea being, if it's a utility and it's going to prevent a negative experience, buy it. If it's something for pleasure, then just rent it, and you can keep renting different things and you can have all kinds of great experiences. Now, Benjamin Franklin wrote, "Poverty wants some things, luxury many things, and avarice all things." So the idea again that your needs are relatively limited, but your wants are unlimited. So spend your money on your needs first. Now, what does that look like in a therapeutic setting? So first, you might help your clients, help educate them on what their needs really are. And this is a really good exercise. Do you see having a lot of money on this list? Well, no. So why do people try and make a lot of money? Well, they're trying to meet these real needs. So that's having people respect them, having people love them. Now, are those the only way to meet those needs? Well, maybe not. So that's a great discussion. So you can help people who maybe they have a lot of money, but they're not spending it well. You can help them set some spending priorities. Now, second, as a therapist, you can help people be honest about their needs. People say, I need all the time, and you can go back to that list and say, I don't see that need on this list, so that must be a want. And of course, after you built rapport with them, you can kind of challenge them on that. Now, third, having a list of real needs could be a good way of helping your clients identify which needs are not being met. That's a jumping off point on how your clients might be able to get their needs met. Now, fourth, for therapists, because you might have all been trained on Maslow, to get past the rigid notion of stages. People don't just crave meaning or want to be competent when everything else is met. Actually, at any stage, regardless of your socioeconomic level and how well your physical needs are being met, you need meaning, you need competence, you need relationships. So like I said before, those are just additive. They don't necessarily go in a particular sequence. So that's good for therapists to know, that it's important for all of your clients to have even those higher level needs met. And just practically helping your clients see options that they might not have considered before. So when you talk about those needs and other ways to meet them, and even how to get the stuff that you need, like garage sales, thrift stores, used car, that kind of thing, that can really be helpful to go through with your clients. So, but the sum total of this principle is to get the life's necessities before going after the luxuries. The third strategy is don't borrow, buy. Another quote from Proverbs says, "The borrower becomes the lender's slave." And how we pay for our purchases can affect how much we enjoy the purchases, especially if we're going into debt in order to get something. Now, thrifty people boost their happiness and build their wealth by paying in advance and avoiding long-term financing and profiting from their financial acumen. But spenders, they buy impulsively with borrowed money, and they dig themselves into a depressing financial hole. Now, spending hurts. And when you turn over the price tag and you look at the price and you say, ouch, you're actually feeling the activation of a part of your brain called the insula. And it's the same brain area that's associated with noxious odors, being treated unfairly, and experiencing social exclusion. So spending really does hurt. Now, of course, retailers know that spending hurts, and they are constantly scheming to sell more by lessening the pain of paying. Now, two of these common techniques are postponing a payment or financing it over time. Now, thrifty people, the way they shop, it looks like they're spending a lot of money, but they're really not. And my wife is a great example of this. Now, I tend to shop at the cheap clothing store places or places like Walmart just to spend the least amount of money possible. But my wife would shop at the mall and actually at the brand name stores, and I thought that was pretty wasteful. But then as I got to know her, I saw how she uses coupons, sales, reward cards, special offers, and she ends up getting stuff for less than I paid at the cheap place. And of course, the quality is a lot better. So it's utterly amazing the way she shops. Now, it's the same for credit cards. So it looks like she's spending a lot of money by putting something on the credit card, but she actually already has the money in the bank. She's just getting the points and the rebates and the kickbacks, and she always pays the balance off in full every time. So she doesn't need to borrow. She's only borrowing because she can make even more money from it. So she bought her last car, a used car, in cash. Like, that's the way thrifty people shop. Now, impulsive shoppers, which was more like me on the other hand, use credit cards because they don't have the money, but they want the goods right now. And the financing lessens the pain of paying, but of course with accumulating negative consequences. Now, almost half of Americans admit worrying some or most of the time about their debts. And a high percentage, at one point 13% of mortgages in the U.S. were behind on payments, seriously delinquent, or in the process of foreclosure. And I think that number has gone up recently. Debt is a real drag, and it's a lot like slavery. If you owe more than you own, losing a job is disastrous. Now, it's already stressful living paycheck to paycheck, but it's even worse when you do get behind on a mortgage or you default on a loan and the creditors start calling and it's just a mess. Debt is a major stress on families and marriages. Now, there's a British household panel study, and remember that bad is stronger than good, remember? So the British household panel study found that psychologically, to offset the detrimental effect of carrying debt, you needed to be regularly saving almost twice as much money. So the other way to say it would be saving money was only half as beneficial as carrying debt was detrimental. And the worst debt was unsecured debt. So that would be things like credit card debt. And in that study, they didn't find a negative impact of carrying secured debt. So that would be maybe like your mortgage. It didn't seem to have that detrimental impact. But I would imagine this might not be true in certain periods of time, such as today, as the housing bubble popped and all of the aftermath of that. So the goal is radical debt-free living, and especially unsecured debt would be the goal. And going back to the slavery analogy, having a brief frolic in the sunshine is no substitute for complete financial emancipation. Now, for therapists, the application is, a number of your clients are going to have debt, a lot of debt, and very little savings. And probably the financial stress and strain of that is going to be negatively affecting their lives and their marriages. Now, people also having money problems probably can't afford to pay much to see a therapist. So some of the things that might be good to do would be to encourage your clients to attack that issue as part of their comprehensive treatment plan. Now, it may not be the highest priority, but it probably should show up there on the list if it's negatively affecting them. And two, helping people see the problems of debt and the benefits of attacking it. So very much like addiction counseling, right? You help them see the negative impact of their financial mismanagement, see the effect that that's having on their lives, and also assess their willingness to work on it and help them to resolve their ambivalence to getting started working on it. I would definitely build up a good list of financial related resources for clients. That might be nonprofit organizations, church group, financial planners, anybody who can help with those issues that they're struggling with to make the referral. And you might even consider leading a group for all your clients who need help with debt, either free or low cost, just to kind of build that support network so that they can encourage each other. And of course, lots of therapists offer like a sliding scale, so that's really helpful for people that are struggling financially, and even for a therapist to build your own skills by taking some personal finance classes. Would probably be helpful both for you and for your clients. Now, debt is so common in the U.S. that you just take for granted that people are going to have it, and a lot of times spenders feel like they don't want to waste their money paying down their debts. They'd rather spend their money on something that they enjoy. But when the debt is there, it does need to be addressed. And by addressing it, it's going to greatly improve your clients' lives and help them to grow and to thrive. Now, the fourth strategy is to postpone pleasure. Henry Wheeler Shaw has written, "One half of the troubles of this life can be traced to saying yes too quickly and not saying no soon enough." We are a culture of instant gratification. And research shows that frugal shoppers can resist the temptation for instant gratification, that they're less impulsive, that they're more self controlled, and they're more deliberate in their shopping habits. Now, there's some kind of unexpected benefits to delays and how they can actually increase our happiness. So, one, a delay allows us time to gather crucial information, do some research before we pull the trigger on the decision. They allow us to kind of be more future minded and consider the future, which also has a lot of benefits. They allow us an opportunity to practice self control and also to experience the joy of anticipation. Now, there's a collection of articles by a newspaper humor columnist, Dave Barry, and he talks about his own hasty boat purchase. So, only after he bought the boat did he take it out for like the test drive and find out all the ways that you can die on the ocean, all the horrible things that can go wrong. And he also learned what he called a fascinating nautical fact, and that is that seawater is really bad for boats. And that means that although you may have dreamed about, the fun of zooming down the waves, actually a lot of your time is spent scrubbing down the hull of the boat after the trip is over. So he finally decided that it was just too much hassle just to actually put the boat in the water. So he just leaves it in the driveway, and he's even, hosted parties or just having people stand in the boat. But if you don't actually put it in the water, then you don't have to clean it up. So that was how it ended up for him. Now, supporting this anecdote, there was actually a study on regretful purchases, and it confirmed that buying impulsively predicted later unmet expectations or even like social embarrassment when using the product. So unless we're an experienced sailor, we typically don't think about maybe the challenges of a boat like shoals, docking fees, or barnacles. And the more distant any event is from us, whether it's in time or space, the more abstract and the more ideal we tend to imagine it. Now, we also tend to overestimate how much happiness we can squeeze out of any single solitary event. So we think something's going to make us really happy, but it doesn't make us as happy as we thought it would. So once the boat becomes ours and the thrill of getting it fades, it's the mundane details of seamanship that are going to become more consequential to our enjoyment. So altogether, happiness is not as much about the great peaks and valleys and more about the small details and hassles. Now, therapists usually think about stressful life events such as moving or divorce, unemployment, the death of a spouse, and those are important for a season, but it's our immediate environment more so than our enduring circumstances that drive our moment-to-moment feelings. Now, enduring circumstances do leave their mark, but only when we're conscious of them. So, for example, you may be a patriotic American and you may feel really happy when you're thinking about how fortunate you are to live in a stable democratic country. But you only think about that maybe when you're watching Saving Private Ryan or when you're cooking bratwurst on Independence Day. On a normal day, most people are going to be maybe fuming about the driver that just cut them off in traffic, or worrying about the next electric bill, or even beaming because they saved 50 cents on a box of bran flakes. So there was a study that followed middle-aged people for 10 months, and what they found was that it was the daily hassles and uplifts, just the little stuff that happened during the day, that was better at predicting how people felt at a particular moment in time than like the life events, which are normally measured on like a life event scale. So the little things do matter, and we ignore them at our peril. So it's best to research the things that we're going to buy before we buy it, and that takes a lot of time. And even when knowing everything in advance might not change our decision, we're actually better off knowing it in advance. So when we think about like buying a new riding lawnmower, you might not want to know about the disappointing Consumer Reports reviews, but receiving the negative information after buying makes us more dissatisfied about our purchase than if we'd simply known beforehand. Even if you do go on to buy it, just knowing ahead of time makes you more satisfied with your purchase. So the details matter, and we should take time to uncover them. But short on the pertinent facts, impulsive buying might leave us more regretful than grateful. Now, there's another benefit of postponing. That is, a delay can boost happiness by ever so slightly bending our judgment towards virtue and away from vice. And that means we're better able to choose what's best for our long term than short term when we choose in advance. So there was a study about eating snacks. So it had participants choosing between what kind of snacks to eat. And the participants tended to choose the unhealthy treats if they were choosing for now, but they tended to choose the healthier ones for the future. A very similar study done with movie choices. So there were two classes of movies. They were there were highbrow movies and there were lowbrow movies. So the highbrow movies had kind of enduring like themes such as like Schindler's List or something like that that are really, not just an ordinary Hollywood movie, but the lowbrow movies were more just pure entertainment, not necessarily any redeeming social value. So what they had the participants do was they had them either choose the movie right before they were going to watch it, or they had them choose what they wanted to watch like every week in advance. And what they found was, so Schindler's List, for example, if people chose it in advance, they selected it 13 times in the study to watch when it was picked ahead of time. But when they were picking right before they're going to watch it, they only chose it once. So you're better off making a choice for the future, and you're more likely to make something that's best for your long-term good than if you're making the decision right now for something that's going to happen right away. Now there's a famous quote from Augustine that expresses this well, that says, "Grant me chastity, but not yet." And that's the same idea. Like he definitely wants this thing, and if he's choosing for the future, he wants it for the future, but he doesn't necessarily want it right now. But by simply distancing the decision from the delivery, a lot of times you're going to employ more logic and a little less libido. So just by postponing the decision or choosing for the future, you're more likely to make a better decision. Now, there's also some benefits of being mindful of the future, just thinking about the future and kind of practicing that. So people vary in how they experience and process the flow of time. So especially the present and the future. So some people see the world through a microscope, and that's like completely focused on the present moment, while the future seems really distant, hazy, and irrelevant. Now, other people see the future, it's like through binoculars. It's magnified, it's prominent, and it's really close. And that's the difference in time perspective. And your time perspective greatly affects your decision making. So, for example, overly present-oriented people tend to make poorer short-term decisions that carry negative long-term consequences. So that might be using drugs. Now, conversely, people who are frugal tend to be more future-focused, and they also tend to use fewer cigarettes, and they're less likely to abuse alcohol in college. So they have that future kind of perspective. And also when buying, present-oriented people want to take the product now, but pay later. But future-oriented people are more willing to pay immediately, even if they don't get the product right away. So developing future-mindedness can also lead to wiser financial choices and greater long-term happiness. Now, there's a lot of benefits to simply learning to delay gratification. This is a core human ability that people need to learn and can benefit from, but they don't always learn it. So Walter Mischel is the famous person. He pioneered the marshmallow test, and that's a whole research paradigm that measured children's ability to delay gratification by having them choose between, it was either a single marshmallow, so that's an immediate reward right now, or 2 marshmallows in the future. So it's a delayed but bigger reward. And it was the ability to delay gratification that led to a lot of positive outcomes for children, adolescents, and even adults. So adolescents who could delay gratification as children went on to earn higher SAT scores. And they're also more socially competent, and they were better able to manage stress. And when they kept tracking people over time, this was even true for these children as they became adults. They were better able to set goals, they were more capable of coping with stress, and they were more socially confident. So there was this huge benefit to learning to delay gratification, and especially in this research paradigm, to learning that as a child. Now, fortunately, research suggests that people can learn patience and self-control. So this is something like the ability to self-regulate is a lot like a muscle, and it can be strengthened through effortful practice. There's some very new research on patience that suggests that some activities like perspective taking or practicing emotional regulation or mindfulness exercises or cognitive reframing can all, like through that practice, actually build patience. And it is true that resisting an impulse is very tiring in the moment, but practicing builds a greater capacity for self-regulation in the future. So the more you practice waiting, the better at it that you get. Now, there's another side benefit to postponing a pleasure, and that is the joy of anticipation. So people who practice anticipation are happier than those who don't. There's a longitudinal study where vacationers wrote about like their vacations both before they took them, while they took them, and after they took them. And so what was interesting was the vacationers actually wrote more positively in their diaries about their vacations before the trip than actually during the trip. So when they looked ahead, the trip seemed much more positive than it actually was. And that's not to say that the vacation itself wasn't positive, but it was just the forecasting of it. It was a lot more positive than it actually turned out to be. So as we discussed earlier, people tend to have these overly abstract and very general views of what a future event is going to be like. So they saw their vacation, really as being something positive. But the actual trip didn't necessarily live up to those rosy expectations. So it's just that the actual thing is a little less positive and a little more nuanced than they might have expected. So what ends up happening is that positive anticipation, it feels good to look forward to something. And if you never have to wait for something, you never get to experience anticipation. And so one way to see that is it's a free ride. And it's not sullied by reality, so it may be unrealistic, but it can still be very enjoyable. Now, expressing kind of the opposite perspective, Carrie Fisher has a famous quote that is, instant gratification takes too long. Like when you don't have patience, when you haven't learned, self-control, any delay seems to be really excruciating. But by using time to your advantage, you can spend money more wisely by, learning more, being more future-minded, practicing self-control, and also enjoying the anticipation before it happens. Now, for therapists, a practical application might be helping clients build self-control. These are activities, that you could do in the context of therapy. So in the Maravan, Baumeister, and Teese article, participants did simple activities like just monitoring and recording what they ate, or working on improving their posture, or working on regulating their mood. And these benefits in self-regulation actually carried over to other tasks that weren't even related to what they practiced. So there's this, so they're really advocating for the perspective that self-control is kind of a general skill and that you can build it doing a lot of different kinds of activities. So another application might be helping clients make decisions in advance and helping to keep them accountable for those decisions. So rather than deciding on the spot, for something that's going to happen now, you can maybe help them think through that big decision far ahead of time, and they're more likely to make a decision that's good for their long term. You can help them think about the future, help them talk through the implications of their decisions, or maybe when they're making big decisions, your questions might help them see some of the details that they might be overlooking. Now that could even be assigning a budgeting exercise like as homework. That could be something really practical that might help them. Or you might have them do some research before they make a big financial decision. I know for me personally, I was kind of interested in buying a house, and after doing the research on it, that got me to be really not interested in buying a house when I discovered how much money was going to cost and how many fees you have to pay and all this. And that's why I've been a happy renter for a long time. But in any case, there's a lot of practical applications that you can help your clients do to help them postpone the pleasure and also reap the benefits, both financial and psychological, from that decision. Now, the fifth strategy is to learn the thrill of saving. Now, some people find it really embarrassing to try and save money. Honestly, I'm kind of in that category. So there was a drugstore promotion where you could keep buying the same item and you keep getting this coupon for bonus dollars. And then if you're really smart, you could use the bonus dollars to buy the same item, but you keep getting more bonus dollars. So I'm with my wife, and she kept going back up to the counter to do another transaction and then going back and going back. And basically you could do it up to 5 times. And at the end, you had only paid for one item, but you got 4 for free. Now, I was so embarrassed that I had to sit in the car while she did it. It just made me too uncomfortable. And then another example, I've always kind of found it a little uncomfortable to shop at a thrift store like Goodwill or something like that. I think I just felt really self-conscious, and maybe people thought that I was poor or something like that. And even when we would go to a trendy clothing store, my wife has this whole stack of coupons, and she's asking the clerk if she can use these 2 coupons at the same time, which actually, as it turns out, she often could. It would still, make me uncomfortable. And the same way at garage sales. I tend to always pay what people are asking, even if it's high, or if it's too high, I just don't buy it. But, I don't really ask for a lower price. But what I noticed was, if you hang around thrifty people long enough, you realize something, that they're not embarrassed about it. They actually enjoy it. And after they get a really good deal, they're quite proud of it. So when I buy something, I kind of just get the thrill out of getting the thing. But the interesting part is thrifty people, they get a thrill out of getting something, but they also get a thrill out of having gotten a bargain. So there's a study that looked at spendthrifts and tightwads, and they have this scale that kind of measures the amount of pain people feel when they're spending money. And the idea is if you're a tightwad, you feel a lot of pain spending money, and spendthrifts, they feel very little pain. And so that's kind of the problem. That's why they spend too much. So what was interesting was the tightwads didn't like spending money on anything. So to them, saving money was just the least painful option. But spendthrifts actually found saving money to be painful. And I can really relate to that. Saving money was painful. It's a lost consumption opportunity. It's like a gadget I can't buy, or it's like some kind of treat that I can't eat. But thrifty people, they're not like tightwads and they're not like spendthrifts. They're completely different because they just enjoy it. It's fun to them, like it's a game. So frugal shoppers describe saving money as like a hobby. They describe it as a treasure hunt. And there's this process of searching for good deals. And sometimes, when you stumble on that one-of-a-kind bargain, they often describe it as thrilling and surprising. So unlike a tightwad, they can enjoy spending money even on kind of trivial pleasures. But unlike a spendthrift, they're really deliberate and they're controlled in their extravagance. So frugal shoppers can indulge their fantasies precisely because they spend so carefully everywhere else. And they also carry less debt, so they feel freer than consumers with really highly leveraged lifestyles. So how do you learn to enjoy saving money? Well, you could get a good how-to book on some kind of money saving skill. So for me, I taught myself how to invest in stocks, and I just learned from a couple of books, and I actually found that it was really enjoyable. So the first time I actually bought a stock and it went up and I made money, I was instantly hooked. And to me, stocks are kind of the same fun that you have playing the lottery that some people get out of playing the lottery, but even the most volatile and riskiest stock is a better investment than the lottery. So I'm not advocating crazy day trading or anything like that, but it's not hard to learn how to safely invest money and not gambling, but actually make an investment. So it could be, how to cook from scratch, or how to be an extreme couponer, or how to buy things at an auction I mentioned before, how to use Craigslist, how to negotiate for a used car. That's a lot of times the reason people don't want to buy a used car is because they don't feel comfortable negotiating. So that was why I wasn't really good at it. But there's actually books that you can buy or resources online where you can learn how to negotiate, what people ask for, what makes the best kind of argument on why the price should be what it is. And that could also be how to make things yourself, how to fix things yourself, or how to buy in bulk even, and how to freeze. So another suggestion would be to kind of keep track of your savings. So putting dollars and cents on the amount that you saved can kind of reinforce the benefits of the activity. So it's kind of the same principle as when you're trying to diet. You could just start by writing down what you're eating, and just writing it down helps you be more aware of it. But in the same way, if you're trying to save, actually writing down how much you're saving can, help you see how much you're doing and kind of reinforce it. Another suggestion, and this was what worked for me, was to make it into a competition. So, I use my wife as an example of really enjoying it. So what I finally decided to do, instead of being embarrassed because of her, I started competing with her. And if I found a good deal, I would say, look what I found. This is really great. And so we would kind of share it with each other. We'd laugh. We'd kind of compete. So it was this great competition for a really good outcome. And this actually worked for, I had a family friend who was in high school, and his economics teacher had the class compete in a stock picking game. So where you're doing virtual money. And I was amazed because he really got into it, especially for the same reason, to kind of compete with the other students. So he started watching CNBC, he started researching companies, and I was amazed at what a little competition could do. Now, and of course, your spouse may not be into it, so you can make some frugal friends and kind of compete with your friends. It doesn't have to be your spouse. And even if you can't find friends, like I said before, there's a lot of online communities of people that you could befriend and kind of encourage each other and kind of even make that into a competition. Now, the implication for therapists, again, are any new skill a client learns is going to build competence and increase their self-esteem. So why not have them learn a skill that's also good for their finances and for their family? So, you could spend your time playing a video game, or you could learn how to be an extreme couponer. And I would argue that something, you can do that helps your family is going to really make you feel better than mastering a video game or, something like that. So even several family members might learn to do something together, and that might be another way to help build the relationship and also do something that's good for the household. Now, one of the sites that I mentioned before, an extreme couponing website, is called the Grocery Store Game. And that's such a great title because it really captures the thrill of frugal shopping. And bargain hunting, it can be as engrossing and as enjoyable as a board game, for example. But the advantage of learning thrift is that when the game is over, you actually get to keep the winnings. So learn the thrill of saving. Now, the sixth strategy is to not impress, but enjoy. So some people show up for the feast of life, but they fill up on the garnish. And modern life is like an endless buffet. It's overflowing with all these alternatives. But what you actually choose determines how much and how long of a boost you actually enjoy. So psychologists make a distinction between two types of goals that produce radically different outcomes. And it's intrinsic and extrinsic pursuits. Now, intrinsic goals involve activities that are personally rewarding and meaningful. So such as spending time with friends or maybe taking a ceramics class. Like you do it because you just enjoy it or it's meaningful. So this is a kind of what you might call soul food, like activities that satisfy your core psychological and social needs for competence, connection, and autonomy. And when your life is full of activities that meet these needs, you're going to feel happy and fulfilled or psychologically satiated. Now, by contrast, external goals are strivings for fame, money, or favorable outward appearances. And you might call that not food so much as a food-like substance. So it's like a bowl of waxed fruit. The extrinsic goal, it looks edible, but it really has no nutritional value. In fact, some might even be harmful for you. So pursuing a lot of extrinsic goals while kind of neglecting the intrinsic ones is a lot like being a junk food addict, where you're always eating the things that aren't good for you and even make you crave more things that aren't good for you while you're actually starving your body of its proper nutrients. Now, we all have limits on our attention and time and energy and money. And the time that we spend chasing what doesn't matter, what doesn't meet our needs, means less time to pursue what does. So, for example, like an entrepreneur, if he's solely obsessed with striking it rich, but he may not actually be doing what he really enjoys or actually getting to see his family because he's spending so much time on making the business work in order to be wealthy. Or you might have an aspiring actress that's so focused on impressing people that she actually has really, really shallow relationships. So positive events that come from fulfilling intrinsic goals brings more happiness than from extrinsic goals. And that's true for several reasons. First reason is that the intrinsic goals directly satisfy our needs. So that's part of the definition. It's like we have those psychological needs and that it's direct. It's not complicated. It meets that need. Now there's also the opportunity for what we might call an upward spiral. So for example, we nurture a relationship and then we feel happier. But being in a good mood actually makes people more social. So then you're more social and then you can build that relationship more. So each kind of reinforces the other. You do something that meets a need, you feel better. Feeling better helps you do more of that. So another example might be being in a good mood actually makes you more generous. But being generous puts you in a good mood. So good outcomes keep reinforcing themselves. And so that's what we call an upward spiral. So there's kind of momentum that can be built up. Now the other benefit to intrinsic goals is that carefully chosen intrinsic goals are actually pretty cheap. So let's look at making a friend versus impressing a friend. Now, it's relatively easy to make a friend. Just talk to somebody, do something nice for them. To impress someone, maybe I need to buy something, I have to dress a certain way, have perfect skin, or keep up with the trends and the fashion. It's a lot harder to impress someone, and that's again an extrinsic goal, than it is just to have a relationship and to talk with someone and get to know someone. So intrinsic goals, again, carefully chosen, can be a lot less expensive. And there's a great deal of relief by not worrying about what other people think and just doing what you like. So, we mentioned before, thrifty people are less susceptible to peer pressure, and they don't have to spend money to follow the trends. Now, we talked a little bit about social comparisons. So people who are happy use social comparisons very selectively, just in ways that make them feel better. So for example, there was a study where a participant was outperformed by someone else at a task. Now, what happens is happy people tend to use their own internal standards for how they do. So they're not as concerned with what someone else is doing. But unhappy people are very sensitive to how other people are doing, and they monitor people very carefully, and they're very sensitive to relative comparisons, and they might even be unhappy even when they've done well if somebody else has done better. Or they may actually feel good after they've done poorly, provided that somebody else did worse, right? So that can actually be bad for your well-being to be so sensitive to social comparisons. So there's benefits to doing just what you enjoy and not following the crowd. So the best use of your money is an intrinsic goal, and it's not worth it to spend a lot of money pursuing an extrinsic goal. So some of the practical applications would be, as we mentioned before, learning a new skill, learning a foreign language, learning an instrument, spending time with people, having coffee with friends, cooking dinner for friends, doing something you want to do rather than something you feel guilted into doing something educational, or doing something good for someone else, which is, what we're going to get to in the next strategy. Now, as therapists, if you give homework, the list of intrinsic pursuits should be a good list to work from. So you might work with the client, figure out what they enjoy, and they may not feel excited about doing it beforehand. And remember we talked about affective forecasting errors. Sometimes people aren't good at predicting what's going to make them happy, but they'll probably enjoy it more after they do it. And you might help them process the positive events to see what it was they really enjoyed about it. Why is it that was such a good thing for them? And you might help process the extrinsic events to see why it was that it didn't quite satisfy their needs. So you can help them to be more authentic in their activities, so what they enjoy versus working for the approval of others. And hopefully these skills will keep them doing the things that make them happy and fulfilled. So the point is that the money is best spent on intrinsic activities that meet core needs rather than extrinsic activities that don't. Now, the seventh strategy is don't hoard, share. William Goodwin writes, "The true source of cheerfulness is benevolence." And generosity, the practice of generosity, can be both enjoyable and also inexpensive. Now, there's all kinds of benefits to being generous. So, for example, studies of adolescents, university students, helping behavior toward their siblings, their parents, and their friends correlated with higher well-being, like more happiness. And also, adults who volunteered or helped their families were happier than those who didn't. And they've even shown that philanthropic acts stimulate areas of the brain that are associated with pleasure and euphoria. And it's not even that generosity just correlates with happiness, but it actually produces it. So there was one study where participants received either $5 or $20 to spend either on themselves or on others before the end of the day. Now, those who spent money on other people, such as buying a toy for like a sibling or purchasing a meal for themselves, reported feeling happier than those who spent the money on themselves. And the interesting part was the actual amount of money didn't actually matter. So whether it was $5 or $20, the benefits of generosity were the same regardless of the amount spent. And of course, generosity doesn't just mean spending money. You can give time, your talent, or treasure. And everybody's got at least one of those in ready supply. So there's a study where college students practice different acts of kindness by holding doors open for strangers or doing a roommate's dishes, and they became happier as a result. They're like, it doesn't have to be money. It can be like an act of kindness. And even simply recalling acts of kindness is actually beneficial for people. So there was another study where people just kept track of the kind things that they did for a week, and they were happier even up to 1 month later. And the more they wrote down, the happier that they were. So why does generosity work? Well, there's a number of reasons why it works and why it makes people feel better. First, it helps people feel like they can make a positive change in their lives. So that it helps them to feel more competent. And it helps them to feel like they can actually improve their relationships, so increasing their sense of self-efficacy. It helps them feel more connected to other people. It increases their own self-regard, so they feel better about themselves, like think that they're a better person. And it gives them more of an internal locus of control, and it also gets their minds off of ourselves. So, excessive self-focus is a hallmark of mental illness. Both the depressed and even the narcissistic, they just think too much about themselves and not enough about other people. So generosity gets your mind off yourself and helps to focus it on other people. Psychiatrist Carl Menninger said it well. He said, generous people are rarely mentally ill. Now, another reason that generosity is good is that sharing with people, especially those who have less than we do, is a very shrewd investment. And if you recall when we talked about money and happiness, the more we have, the less it matters. But the reverse is also true. The less we have, the more it matters. So a little bit sent down to those less fortunate than us actually increases the happiness purchasing power. And that joy can actually spill back over to us. So that's one of the benefits, especially of helping those who have less than we do. And we can always find people who have less than we do. Now, some of the practical applications, I mean, this is a great homework, practical application for your clients. Do acts of kindness for other people. This would be like a good just default homework assignment. I mean, get your mind on someone else, and that would help with a lot of mood disorders, a lot of depression. Just keep track, do it, keep track of it, and then report back. Now, that could be doing acts of kindness for family members. So one of there was a book that a lot of churches use. It was on the bestseller list for a long time. It was called The Love Dare, and it was kind of a Christian devotional book. But the cool part about it was it had this behavioral activity that you're supposed to do. It's a different thing every day for 40 days. So for example, the first one was resolve to say nothing negative to your spouse. Another one was do something unexpectedly kind, or buy something that says, I was thinking about you. And then they would do it and they would write down what they learned. Now, it was not uncommon for people to find, after 10 days or so, if it even took that long, like your spouse was thinking, what is up with they're treating me differently, they're doing all these different things, like what is going on? And that was a great model because it was step by step, really simple things, and it promoted generosity. So that might be, something to do for clients, just some really practical steps. You don't have to think a lot of planning. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be something really simple. Buy something that says, I was thinking about you. So for a client, it might be volunteering at a church or a nonprofit service organization. That could be really beneficial for them. Or even something as simple as sharing something that they've enjoyed with someone else. So that might be a book that they enjoyed, a novel, a movie. And so the cool thing is you're actually doing something for somebody else. But for that person, if they've never watched that movie before or never read that book before, it's like you get to relive the experience through them because it's new to them. And that's one of the reasons why we like to watch movies with people who haven't seen it before, because we're reliving it vicariously through them. Or you could take friends to a restaurant that you like. It's basically a really handy hack for adaptation. So it helps you re-experience it as if it was for the first time. And if you have wealthy clients who aren't feeling fulfilled, maybe putting some serious effort into very intentional generosity might be beneficial for them. Now, according to Andrew Carnegie, he was the second wealthiest man in history. The man who dies rich dies disgraced. So rather than hoarding his enormous wealth, he funded libraries and schools and universities, and by the time he died, he'd given away over $4 billion in today's dollars, which is about 90% of his wealth. So when we share from our abundance, whether it's money, it's time, or it's skills, to those who lack it, that means we multiply the impact of what we give. And also we reap a lot of benefits for our own happiness in the process. It's very, very good for us. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Now, the eighth strategy is don't have, do. Life is not about stuff. Now, there's the famous quote from Jesus that says, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Now, Ben Franklin has a quote, and it's interesting because in his later years, it seemed like he really kind of got away from his values because he was always someone who lived simply, and during his later years, he lived very richly. But he always maintained that wealth is not his that has it, but his that enjoys it. Life is about experiences. And happy people are happy from the abundance of their experiences, not the abundance of their possessions. And this finding actually even holds up even for highly materialistic people. Experiences simply make us happier than possessions do. And, it's the potency of experiences over possession. It's simultaneously obvious, but it's also counterintuitive. Now, straightforwardly, when you look back at your life, people tend to value their life experiences, even the difficult ones. So lying on your deathbed, there's few people that would pine for one last look at their luxury car. But instead, most people would yearn for more time or more experiences with people that they care about. However, when shopping, people tend to underestimate how satisfied they will be with having spent money on an experience. So people tend to gravitate towards buying possessions, even though in the end they're going to feel less happy about them. So that's another kind of affective forecasting error. Well, people can't predict what's going to make them happy. So perhaps maybe when we start thinking about cost benefits, like we think of an experience as something that has nothing left over, but with a possession there's something left over, so that's why we gravitate towards it. But that's actually not how it plays out as far as it pertains to our happiness. So why are experiences better? Well, we've got several reasons why they're better. First, a possession is a potential pleasure, but an experience is active enjoyment. So we only experience something when we use it. So that's when we touch it, we taste it, we're looking at it, we're hearing it, we're smelling it. So you can have a beautiful Rembrandt, but it doesn't inspire anybody if nobody's looking at it. Or you can have your tennis racket, but it actually serves no purpose if it's just buried in the closet. So we enjoy things as we squeeze experiences out of possessions. So theoretically, the best stuff to own is something that promotes all kinds of novel experiences. And one thrifty strategy is, instead of buying something new, actually to do something new with something you already own. So for example, you might, you have a car, maybe a new car, or a car that's new to you. You could visit some new place in your car that you've never been to before. So that's squeezing a new experience out of something you already own. You've got a computer. Why don't you download some new software on the computer? Learn how to do something new on the computer that you haven't done before. Or you have a house that you remodeled. Why not have some friends over and have a party in your new house that you've kind of gotten used to? So again, new experiences. Download a new app for your smartphone, or get some new music for your iPod. So it's getting more experiences out of something that you already own. And the second reason experiences are better than possessions is that possessions are predictable, but experiences are full of surprises. Now, in general, we adapt to something when it doesn't change. We adapt more quickly. So that means we adapt to possessions more quickly than experiences. And that's just because a variable stimuli resist adaptation longer than an unchanging one. So even if we take an ocean cruise like to the same place, it's going to be a little different each time. We may meet different people. We may eat some different food. We may stay in a different room. So it's going to be different, even if it's to the same place. But something like a decorative vase, the only way it changes is that it gathers dust. An experience is naturally more variable. Now, there's some tricks, of course, with your possessions to make them more variable too. So you might rearrange the furniture, and you ever notice how after you rearrange the furniture, you kind of see everything in a new way for a little bit. So you're getting more out of what you already have, or even changing where the pictures are hung because you've gotten used to where the pictures are and you don't notice them anymore. So you change everything up, and suddenly it stands out again. But in general, experiences tend to be full of surprises, whereas possessions are really predictable. Now, the next reason is possessions break, but the interesting thing about memories is they keep getting better with time. So my dad has a ton of stories about our family, our growing up experiences. And he has this really funny story about the Christmas tree from hell. And it was the year we decided to try and put a really tall Christmas tree in our living room, and it was too tall, and it kept breaking stuff. It was just really funny. The interesting part is the more often he tells it, actually, the funnier it gets. And I think the current version bears very little resemblance to what actually happened, of course, and you can just ask my mom and she'll confirm that. But that is kind of the funny thing about memories, is that they tend to become more positive as time passes. And that's a phenomenon known as rosy recollection. So when we think about college, you may remember the friendships or the crazy things you did on the weekend, but you may not remember the stress of term papers or the stress of exams. So possessions break, but your memories keep getting better. Now, another reason is experiences are great, is that many experiences are free. It's hard for people to give you free stuff, but with a little creativity, there's an endless supply of cheap or free experiences. So that could be a nearby historical marker, hiking trails, city parks, beaches. They cost practically nothing to visit, or even going to a really expensive hotel, but not staying there, just enjoying the view from the lobby. And you don't have to rent the room in order to enjoy the view. You could go to an ethnic grocery store, and that a lot of times feels like going to a foreign country. Creative people can make an adventure out of almost anything. So many experiences are free. That's one of the advantages of experiences. Now, the next reason experiences are better than possessions is that possessions do not satisfy our deepest needs, but the right experiences do. Many experiences are naturally social, and you can make kind of anything fun when you bring a friend along. And also experiences can be really challenging, like an unexpected adventure that helps build competence. But possessions really don't meet our needs. So continuing to possess something is not really a challenge. It's actually kind of a hassle when you have too much stuff and your garage is overflowing. So that can be kind of a disadvantage of possessions. Now, products also invite comparisons, but experiences tend to stand apart. So in my experience, you buy some gadget, you buy a 30 gigabyte iPod, and then they come out with a 60 gigabyte iPod, like at the same price. It's really easy to compare products, but experiences are a lot harder to compare. So, for honeymoon, my friends went to Club Med in the Maldives. My wife and I went to Puerto Rico. Now, it's kind of difficult to compare. Okay, they had a bungalow on the beach. We had a swim in a bioluminescent bay. Okay, that's kind of different, hard to compare. And of course, the thing that's most different is that only I got to go with my spouse. That's the best part. So experiences are unique and they're highly individualized and they vary just even depending on who you're with. And finally, we are the sum of our experiences, not our possessions. So people identify with their experiences far more than they do with their possessions. And this has been shown in research. Possessions always remain apart from us. They're always tucked away in a shelf or in storage or in the garage. But our experiences are encoded into our very existence. And you could say they literally become a part of us in our minds and in our memories. And we can't help but carry them everywhere. So our experiences are what make us who we are. And that's another reason why an experience is better than a possession. So the practical application here is when you're giving homework to your clients, think experientially. What experience can they have that is going to meet an unmet need, may not cost that much, or be something that they can do, maybe provide a little bit of a challenge but not too much, and especially help them find activities that they like to do. Now, the main disadvantage of experiences is that they're easily forgotten. And this is one of the reasons why we take pictures on a vacation and we buy souvenirs. By making some kind of physical reminder, you're more likely to trigger the pleasant memories. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now in the next strategy. Don't forget, remember. Now we're going to start moving more to activities that you can practice to make the most out of what you have. And we don't always have to do new things or buy new things. We can actually recycle happiness. So you use what you already have or you've already done. Brazilian writer Paulo Coelho writes that every blessing ignored becomes a curse. And gratitude and reminiscence are two practices that allow us to continue to enjoy what we already have longer. Now, William James noted that my experience is what I agree to attend to. But on the other hand, when something doesn't attract attention, we pretty much adapted to it. We've gotten used to it. So focused attention helps forestall adaptation. Now, you remember the study I mentioned before that owners of luxury sedans weren't happier during their car trips than owners of compact two-door coupes unless their car's attributes were on their minds while they were driving. Now, in the same way, people who continue to be aware of some kind of positive change in their lives have been shown to be less likely to adapt to that change. So focused attention. Now, gratitude is simply focused attention and appreciation on what's good in our lives. And grateful people are happier, they're more hopeful, they're more self-actualized, they feel better, and they have more fulfilling interpersonal relationships. Now, experiments have documented that the regular practice of gratitude can boost happiness. Now, similarly, you can also practice reminiscence or reflection. So, for example, you might go through like a photo album, either online, offline, maybe watch old movies, or go back through your old email messages, or even, when you're together with friends and you're telling stories, from the past, and everybody's kind of laughing together. So photos and movies can help kind of jog your memory on things that you'd forgotten about. And of course, with friends, they're always going to remember details that you didn't. Now, there's another thing you can do. It's called counterfactual thinking. And the best example of this is It's a Wonderful Life. So remember how George gets to see what the world would have been like if he hadn't existed. And so counterfactual thinking is thinking about what good things almost didn't happen. what if I'd never asked my future wife out for coffee? Or what if I'd never applied to that grad school? Or what if I'd never met that friend who went on to change my life? So just like George Bailey, if you kind of run through that exercise, when you return to reality, oftentimes you're going to be a lot more grateful than when you left. Now, these activities are really practical, and you can use them in therapy, again, for homework exercises or actually to practice in therapy. So that might be focus attention on blessings. Do that in the therapy session. It might be writing a gratitude letter. So that's just a letter thanking someone for the positive impact that they've had on your life. You don't even necessarily have to deliver the letter, because just writing it is beneficial, but delivering it can be even better. So in one study of a lot of different kinds of positive activities, they actually had people make a gratitude visit. So that was write down all the things that that you appreciate about the difference this person has made in your life, and then actually go and visit them and share all those things with them personally. And of all the activities that people practice, that was actually the one that had the biggest impact, is actually making like a gratitude visit. Now, it could also be documenting an experience as you have it, so taking pictures, making sure that you don't forget it. It could be taking time to reminisce, going back through all your digital photos and looking at all the great experiences that you had, or even practicing that counterfactual thinking. And it's helpful to have a therapist there so it doesn't go in the wrong direction. Some people may say, oh, it'd be better if I never met my wife, but of course, you don't want it to go that way. But helping to guide it so that people can see all the beneficial things that have happened in their life and how it could have definitely been a lot worse had it not happened that way. So you help them steer it back to the good things. So those are all things that, just practical things that can help people to remember, and they don't have to spend money, but can actually make them happier. Now, the final strategy is don't binge, savor. Now, there's actually this professional sports association. You may have seen them on TV. It's called competitive eating. And they have like hot dog eating contests. And there's this famous competitive eater. His name is Takuru Kobayashi, and he's this world champion. He has this whole strategy for how to dunk a hot dog in water and pretty much just swallows it whole. Now, to other competitive eaters, he gives this advice. He says, if you can taste something, you're not at the maximum of your ability. So clearly, hot dog eating contest, it's about maybe competing, it's about pushing yourself, it's about winning, maybe building pride, but it's not about tasting. It is not about savoring the taste of a hot dog. Now, probably none of us have actually swallowed an entire hot dog, but how many of us have swilled down like a cup of coffee, or eaten a piece of pie just in a few bites, or made short work of a Snickers bar? We do things too quickly. We binge, and speed is the saboteur of savoring. Now, just slowing down a positive experience naturally heightens enjoyment. So let's say you want to enjoy visiting southern Thailand. Now, how much of it are you going to enjoy if you just fly over it in a 747? So you're only going to see what flashes by the windows. You might see the water and the islands for a few minutes, but there's not much to kind of enjoy. Now, what if you took a train across the countryside or a bus, and you definitely see more, but it would take a lot longer, but you'd get to experience more. But the best experience might be to walk the streets, and you could smell the jasmine flowers, and you could eat a sweet, freshly cut pineapple. You could smell the grilling chicken satay, and you could feel the powdery white sand in between your toes and swim in the crystal clear waters. But of course, that would take a long time because you have to slow down. Now, savoring means slowing life down and living in the moment and consciously focusing on the pleasure that you're experiencing to heighten and prolong it. And the practice of savoring promotes happiness. And it does so pretty economically because it squeezes more pleasure out of what you already have. Now, here's a really interesting fact. Having access to an unlimited supply of something actually reduces the amount that you're going to savor. So if you think about it, when's the last time you savored something on a buffet? Okay, buffets are really not about savoring, right? It's about quantity. And actually, sometimes the quality tends to be really low. But the idea is, why would you make the most of a single experience when you know you can always get more? One interesting study had two groups of people both eating a chocolate bar. And there were people hidden behind the mirror that were kind of evaluating how how much the person seemed to enjoy eating the chocolate bar. And the only difference between the two groups was one group had been primed with money. And primed means they saw pictures of money, but they weren't necessarily aware that this was part of the study, and nobody really called their attention to it, but they're pretty sure people saw the picture of money. So that's what they call being primed kind of unconsciously with money. And the other group wasn't. And what happened was those who'd been primed with money enjoyed the chocolate bar less. Like they ate it faster and they seemed to enjoy it less. So even, subconsciously, when you can get more, the idea is, why would you make the most of a single experience? So you treat the present as though it's less precious. So active savoring helps combat this tendency, and that's treating every bite as if it's the last one. A quote from a German romantic novelist is, "Sleep, riches, and health, to be truly enjoyed, must be interrupted." And this is another really insightful quote about, the human experience that actually rings true. Now we hate commercials, right? So when you're watching your favorite, CSI, Law and Order, something like that, you hate the commercials. But a study actually shows that commercials actually increase the enjoyment of a TV program. And if you think about it a little bit, it makes sense why. So as you're watching the program, you get this burst of enjoyment, and then it comes back down as you slowly adapt to what you're doing. But then there's a commercial, and then there's a break, and then adaptation starts all over again when the program comes back on. So breaks are actually good for positive experiences because they interrupt adaptation. But in the same way, breaks are bad for negative experiences for the same reason. So if you're enduring like a dental drill or some kind of painful procedure, you actually want adaptation working for you. So you want to just get it over with, don't stop, don't take a break. But if it's a positive experience, then breaks are actually good. So along the same lines, it's actually the frequency of positive experiences that's more important than their intensity. So it's about quantity. If you break a positive experience down into chunks, you'll actually enjoy it longer. So for example, don't read the whole book in one night. Just do a chapter at a time. Or don't, and this is my problem, don't eat the whole chocolate bar. Break it up into little pieces. Maybe instead of an hour massage, you might do 2 30-minute massages. Or you might give 5 different $5 gift cards rather than a single $25 gift card. So there's a great quote from Michael Pollan who says, "The banquet is in the first bite." And so when you're segregating an experience using breaks or breaking it into different experiences, you're actually multiplying the first bites. And those are the best part of any experience. Now, of course, there is such a thing as too much segregation. So maybe too many pieces of a cookie is just a pile of crumbs. So you want to not break it up too much. But taking a break or dividing consumption experiences into discrete episodes can be good for your well-being without having to get any more of that thing. So what about an extended break? Now, consider that 5 of the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, all promote temporary abstinence from food, sex, or other common activities for periods of time. So in Ramadan, people fast from eating, drinking, and sex during daylight hours. In Orthodox Judaism, married couples don't even touch when the wife is menstruating. Now, to modern readers, voluntarily abstaining from any natural desire kind of appears hopelessly antiquated, but there's a lot of reasons why these practices persist and people find them beneficial. So consider the benefits of interrupting a positive experience, of building anticipation, of practicing self-control, of cultivating gratitude. So fasting may be an ancient practice with special relevance in cultures of abundance like ours. So some of the practical applications might be to help your clients practice savoring, help them slow down and enjoy what they have, or help them to add maybe more frequency of positive experiences to their lives. Now, if they're open to it, practicing maybe a spiritual discipline like fasting that might be from their religious background might be helpful to them, or taking a break, meditation, or mindfulness, which can help them focus on the here and now. But in general, by practicing savoring instead of binging, it's possible to get more pleasure out of life without having to buy more and spend more. It's a very economical practice. Now, as we mentioned at the very beginning, although income and happiness are related, there's a large proportion of happiness that's fully independent of wealth. And even considering both genes and circumstances, more than a third of the differences in individuals' levels of happiness are unexplainable by genes or circumstances, and thus they're potentially amenable to change. Now, we talked about some of the optimal conditions of thrift, and we talked about 10 ways to apply thrift to boost happiness. In particular, I highlight the virtue of thrifty and happiness-boosting activities that cost less because of their special relevance to the modern era. Now, in difficult times, such as what we've had recently, thrift can add enjoyment without costing more. It can help people who need to cut back without it being so miserable. But even in plentiful times, which hopefully are in our future, thrift can help focus us on what matters. And also there's this environmental aspect to thrift as well. So we recently hit 7 billion people in the world. Now, the Earth has a lot of resources, but one thing is clear. I'm not sure it's going to be a good thing if even a sizable percentage of the world's population live a really materialistic lifestyle. So what thrift means is that not only can the individual flourish, but potentially the whole community can flourish too, without destroying the earth in the process. So thank you so much for your attention. Please give us some feedback on this class and check out the supplementary materials that we provided. So we have some internet financial resources, and we also have some recommended books for more reading on these topics. Thank you very much.